At this point, I must thank Richard. Tisdall Associates are sponsoring today's event, and it would be good to just have a few words from you, Richard, in terms of why you wanted to do this and why it's kind of timely to do so.
Yes, thanks, Yvonne, very much for organising today. It's going to be a very exciting discussion. It's good to see everyone. I think for us, probably one of the key pivotal movements to start with was Michael Marmot's review back in 2010, Fair Society, Healthy Lives, which we're all very familiar with. And since that time, he had two really many policy ideas, but two in particular relevant to today was his policy E, which was to create healthy places and communities, and his policy F, which was to strengthen prevention. And it's been remarkable and encouraging that over that period of time since then, there have been major moves forward over a whole range in terms of policy. We've got the MPPF, we've got obviously the change of bringing public health into local authorities. Joint working, the Greater Manchester example, joint working now $6 billion a year in integrated NHS and adult care. We've got social prescribing, which William will share more on later, which is very exciting. Economic evaluation, what happened here. And all of us in different ways looking at different aspects of society. And as a landscape architect, but also passionate about health, the question arises, how can we actually improve the environment to be part of prevention, to be part of creating healthy communities? And so the feeling behind this in discussion, obviously with yourself and Tony and Rich, was to say, is there a context where we can explore that? Because it's only going to be done in an integrated way. And I think a platform like this to sort of share experiences and bring that together with some really policy objectives and targets, I think, from my point of view, would be valuable. No one of us is going to do it by ourselves, but I think working together, there are immense opportunities. So that was really the background.
We'll get straight into the discussion. And the first question I'd like to pose really, people use parks for a variety of reasons, we all know this. And I'm interested in how that's changed over time. So how would people valued parks kind of historically, do people think? And then we'll maybe move into that context of how people are doing that more so in modern society. So I don't know if anybody would like to kind of chip in with an initial view. I don't know if anything's come out of the report Helen Whitfield and Trust has produced around this notion, or just a general perception really.
Sure. So we published a report called Revaluing Parks and Green Spaces last month, and the motivation for doing that really was to try and look at it from a different perspective from our point of view. So one of the things that we as an organisation were continually finding to be a challenge was, how do we demonstrate the impact of these parks and green spaces that instinctively and anecdotally we all know are good for us? How can we quantify that in a way that can help us make a better business case for the continued provision of parks and green spaces? And the backdrop for that really was being able to see that local authorities are in a position, to varying degrees across the whole of the UK, where budgets are extremely constrained. Parks and green spaces are a non-statutory service, and so how do we change the perception around the importance and value of being able to ensure we continue to have provision for these spaces, and that we don't just look at them as historically I think we have done, in terms of the cost of maintaining them and running them. So we don't see these spaces as just as a liability. We try and address and create a counterpoint for that in a way that we think will speak. And one of the ways that we thought would have impact in terms of that argument was to quantify an economic value to parks and green spaces, and that's what we attempted to do through our new report, as I said, that was published last month, to try and assign a value and a set of values to parks and green spaces that exists as a national data set, but then can be applied at a local level, that we hope will then be useful for individual local authorities and other stakeholders, not just limited to local authorities, to be able to demonstrate the dividend.
Yeah, sorry, do you feel with your experience within the organisation that the way that people use parks has changed, particularly from say 1925 right through to, or would you say that's very similar?
I think this probably changed quite dramatically during that time. I think the way that we see and experience those spaces is very different now, although I think some of the motivations for use remain very much as they were when the Victorians established a huge number of municipal parks in terms of creating better health and well-being for community. I mean, I think we see that use is very important in both urban and rural settings, and so I don't think that there's a distinction that was there necessarily so much. But I think that idea of the parks and green spaces creating places where we can improve our health and well-being across the spectrum. So it's not just a space for physical activity, it's a space where communities can come together, it's a space where we can improve our mental health, where there are all kinds of different outcomes that are generated by these spaces. And I think from our perspective as an organisation, one of the difficulties is and always has been, that primarily a park or a green space is a resource that's free at the point of access. So issues around how do you track how many people are using a park or green space, and I know we've all made huge strides in terms of how a lot of that data can be gathered. But the basic premise of a park or green space makes it quite difficult in some ways to monitor and evaluate the impact that it's bringing to the local community. And so I think the piece of work that we've done and lots of other pieces of work that have been done in the recent past have really helped to frame that slightly differently, so that we see where they have an important role to play, particularly because I think informal spaces are going to be much more important in addressing issues of inactivity and getting to those harder to reach communities. You're not necessarily going to pitch up at your local football club if you're not currently active. You might go and engage in some activity in a park or green space in that informal setting.
Sure. That's a really good point. Lee, from a Commission's point of view within the City of Manchester, have you seen any significant difference in your time in post in terms of how parks are being used?
I think certain parks, certainly, because at their core, I was thinking of Alexandra Park in Manchester, and you talked about Alexandra Park, one of the first Victorian parks, and we recently, the last couple of years, refurbished it. Fantastic HDF grant, sporting grant, and we really changed or upgraded the sports facilities. But when we got the Victorian maps out of the very first design, thinking of the architectural sort of scope of that park, you saw sports facilities, tennis courts in certain, you saw bowls, greens, you saw amphitheatres, you saw recreation, well-being, sports and physical activity at that time. And here we are, hundreds of years later, redesigning those sports facilities. So there are parts where the historical use is still at the core of how they're used today, and other types of parks, a bit more destination or entertainment type parks, you see different types of activities. You might see music concerts or festivals. So you can see changing types of activity, but even when you're talking in the large-scale event or music festival, it's still about bringing the community together. So I think that the heart of the use is actually stayed quite consistent, but the way of how recreation provision has changed, people's interest, that you can see real change there.
I think the thing that strikes me the most is the democracy of the space, and I don't think that's necessarily changed over time either. You think about when parks were first set up. And the other thing that resonates really strongly is the motivations bit. So when people talked in the very unscientific research that I was just doing on social media this week about what they valued about their experiences in parks, open spaces, was being able to breathe, being able to connect, being able to spend time with family, and the stresses and strains. And William would be good to come in here on kind of the stresses of life and the sort of pressures that people are under. But what they were describing, it strikes me, might be different stresses and strains in life now compared to the industrial era or whatever, but they're still there. And being out in open spaces and green spaces with family, friends, etc., is about sense of connection with each other, time to breathe, time to relax, connect with nature and all that. So it's just really interesting. I think it changes, but it doesn't change, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And is there thinking of how parks used to be funded, how did that work comparatively to how it works now? We know there's increasing budget pressures for sure. Is the review that's changed massively?
The parks were gifted to authorities from landowners. So it's almost how far back do you go to look at how they were funded. So if rich landowners of the day, that's how they were funded. It was their open space to have friends or communities around. If they're gifted to authority, local authorities, who by definition then holding them in trust for the benefit of the people. Then historically, local authorities have then carried on with the investment and the funding of parks. So, and that's been the case for certainly Manchester and other local authorities for many, many years. So, I think I know we'll get on to what's next in the future, but with local authority budgets under huge pressures, the absolute essential approach in the future is about partnership. You know, and it depends on it, and that's just the same for any business. You know, if your business is developing computers, you do it in partnership. If you're trying to run sustainable, vibrant parks, you need to do it in partnership. So that's how local authorities have to start to think differently and work with all different types of organisations, because local authorities are part of the answer, but they're not just the answer. So, but historically, it's been funded one way. Certainly, more in my lifetime, local authorities fund them, and their budgets are being cut. Let's get creative and let's ensure that we've got these amazing spaces for many generations to come.
And do you feel that sort of those conversations are starting to happen? Are there any examples where actually there is kind of that creative approach within a place? And I guess it's open to anybody. I look to you, Lee, because I know you're closer to that on the ground. But
we're having lots of discussions, you know, and some of the challenges that we have to think when our parks are gifted to authorities to hold them trust, and they've got most of them have a number of restricted covenants, but rightly so. So they should do. So how do we be respectful of those covenants, in those parameters, to build those partnerships, to get investment into parks, to make them private places for the communities to be? Those conversations are happening all over the country. I don't think yet we're seeing the absolute outcome of all of those discussions, but we're certainly having the right discussions.
Okay, that's brilliant. Is there anything from just thinking of the scenario within Greater Manchester and devolution and, you know, the real joining up under the GM Moving banner, are there any thoughts around how that kind of conversation could be brought into a more wider place-based approach, I guess? Lou, Hayley?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking in terms of how parks... You okay there, I was thinking about how parks were originally set up from a very public health perspective. You know, industrial, certainly in a city region, industrial spaces to escape smog, poverty, dirty streets, etc. So you know, that's perhaps when it was set up. Arguably accessed more by middle class people who can get to those places, you know, draw up in their horse and carriage or whatever, play the sports, whereas the poor people still playing out in the street in the slums are... Well, actually, in reflecting on current usage, you know, there's an underrepresentation of, you know, working class people using quality good spaces. There are still inequalities around access to parks, and we do know that from a public health perspective, that, you know, people are, with access to green space, have better health outcomes. We know that the value of parks includes the contribution to environmental cleaner air, you know, and that is really important in terms of connecting green spaces not only to physical activity and health, but air quality, CO2, the biodiversity work. So actually, we're coming back round to these broader agendas because we need to, and because we need to broaden the range and the input and the value in those terms as well.
That's a really good point.
And it's connecting the two things in terms of if you think about Greater Manchester's commitment to working in the community and voluntary sector as equal partners. But going back to what Lee was saying, I think there are a range of options, aren't there, for the future of parks, and in some places it might be the right thing that community and voluntary sector play a bigger role in managing and taking care of green, you know, open spaces. But in some places that might be really difficult if there's not the social capital there to do that. So I think we need to be really careful about, you know, that blend, I guess, and that range of options. Of it doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation, but it's got to be very bespoke to, you know, a neighbourhood level. Really, what's the right solution for this park in this neighbourhood? It might be very different to one down the road.
I think as well,
from an asset transfer point of view, that's what I think. So,
I think in terms of the context of this discussion, well, which is valuable. It's to my mind getting the link between who are the beneficiaries of the parks. Now, the beneficiaries of the parks is obviously the wider community, And the starting point is how to broaden the use of the parks for the health of the whole community, particularly in deprived areas. But also, if the savings from the health benefits are being linked to public health, adult care, NHS, then is there not a case, at least for discussion? I know it cropped up in the public park review from the local government communities recently, that in terms of specific strategies, health and wellbeing boards should be in a position to contribute to the maintenance and production of parks. It was their policy 78, I think, or 78. And I wonder whether in this discussion there is that opportunity to broaden out and say, well, who are the beneficiaries? Because to date, it's a park is a place to go, we walk, we sit, we play. But within the context of health, we're investing today for tomorrow's health and well-being. And therefore, is there a case to broaden that ownership and sense of responsibility for our open spaces?
But I think it's health in a wider determinants way, not just physical, mental health thing. Right. It's also air quality. It is
very much so. Yes.
Yeah. That moves us on
radiation, yes.
quite nicely, actually, because obviously there are a huge amount of people suffering from ill health, which could be prevented. And I suppose that goes back to the accessibility of parks. It goes back to the promotion of spaces for them. And I don't know whether, William, from your point of view as a GP and all the work that you're involved with, does this notion of this wider angle of health, as Louise has just suggested, does that create a different paradigm for parks and open spaces to be positioned differently in a strategic conversation that could potentially allow for the wider contributions to that space than we see currently?
I mean, the discussion started with actually the Victorians and what they felt the use of parks, and in Victoria Park in London, they're still at the back saying that there was this one central place where everyone was dying early, and the perfect deaths and marriages said this is wrong, so let's make a park there. And that was the kind of absolute solution, a health solution to a problem. And it still remains that. And I think what we should be looking at from a park point of view is from our going right back to what keeps us going and what gives that resilience. It is that people pay purpose and place. So the connections in communities, the place, and with the place, it has to be nature. It's not just green space, it's blue space. And you must remember that actually the almost stronger, that the water aspect is really strong. But our brains are programmed that when we actually connect with nature, that we increase our resilience, we reduce stress, we can take on a lot more stressful things, and therefore we don't go down that pathway of stress going to inflammation, which leads to long-term conditions, which is the main problem. It's because we're in a very stressful environment and away from nature. The more we're disconnected from nature, the evidence is very clear that the more stress and the less resilience we can do. So the park is the actual solution. However, there's kind of several problems. First of all, what is the dose of nature? So, what kind of park actually produces a health benefit? So, an open green space of a kind of playing field may not be actually particularly helpful for space unless you're running around, because it's actually a little bit kind of bleak and barren, and it may not be conducive to actually go. So, there's lots of evidence about what makes a good park. The other thing is just democratisation, that there are an awful lot of people who live next to a park who don't believe it belongs to them, and that particularly affects the more deprived communities, where you see, absolutely within 20 yards of a park, having never set foot in it for years, and even on waterfronts, etc. In Truro, the headmistress who said most of her 16-year-olds had never been to the beach, and that was just a few few hundred yards away from where they live in their housing estate. So we've got this issue that if you build a park, it doesn't necessarily people will come to it. Yeah. So we've got to find out a whole behaviour change. A park is the integral part of the community. Without it, when you take a park away, the community fragments. But for policymakers, unfortunately, this term leisure has come in, and therefore when you talk about leisure only, people feel it's an add-on, a nice to have, and not essential. And we've got to kind of get our wording right that actually this is integral. But I would say the challenges we've got is what kind of park? Is a community really human beings and nature, and unfortunately put a few buildings in the middle, and therefore actually the map should be not a few parks there, nature should be all the way through it, and then you've got these buildings that get in the way. And then that's how we should look at it. And in which case then, what is it about trees in the street that make a difference? It's not just the parks, it's the whole infrastructure. So what makes the best difference on parks? And then also, how do you connect people to it? And I think that's the real challenge we're still working out.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. And when you think of parks as this universal offer, and then as we know around any sort of inactive populations, you need to drill down. So Paul, I'd like to come to you in terms of just considering this from the point of view of the older population, and that's not necessarily old and frail. What age do we class people as old?
I don't think there's any definition that anybody can agree on other than it's usually 15. Yes. Other than it's 15 years older than we are. Kind of. If you're Somalian in the city of Manchester, 50 is probably old.
Right.
If you're 75 in Didsbury, you might not think of it. So who knows what the answer to that question is. I think I was going to say I wanted to be a slightly dissenting voice in all this discussion. Partly because it's good to have a bit of dissent, isn't it? And I guess it's a question of language and approach. Because if you think back to the Victorians, the parks weren't just places for physical activity, they're actually places where people defined power and relationships, and they were places, in a little bit in the way that the town halls and city halls were bought and designed as kind of places of civic power, in the way that cathedrals had been before them and so on. So for me, the kind of position, and also the language around prevention is an interesting one as well, and leisure and all this, because we've done loads of projects, and I won't speak at length about them, so I haven't got a lot of time now. But quite often people will attach this language of prevention to some of the social activities that older people are involved in. And I think it's kind of a mistake, really, in a way, because those same activities we wouldn't describe for ourselves as being preventative. They're just things that we enjoy doing because, whether it's going to the cinema or going out with our friends, they're just things that we enjoy doing that create a better life for ourselves. So there is a thing around language, and I think particularly with older people, however we define them, the language very quickly becomes one of prevention, of ill health, of one of and of using the kind of language of activity and physical activity and so on, particularly in the poorest neighbourhoods, where those things just don't seem to make sense in people's everyday lives. I was reading an article, coincidentally, earlier this week from a Journal of Health Psychology, and one of the key messages around the whole prevention, physical activity, whatever we describe it, agenda, particularly for the poorest, most disadvantaged groups, is that quite often the messages that come from us around you should get active, you should get involved in all that stuff, actually creates confusion and creates a lack of a discourse with those groups that we want to speak to. So actually, I think, and the issue for the oldest groups is that they're least likely to visit parks, particularly in the poorest neighbourhoods. They're least likely to be involved in their communities. So we have to position the whole discussion about green spaces, blue spaces, and all the rest of it, about how people access them, what they think about them, what their attachment to them as young people might have been, and kind of go to them and talk to them about how they'd like to use those spaces. And I think we get a completely different set of answers than the language that we internally and externally use. So that's kind of, I think, the challenge really for us. I should say that I've just started cycling around my local park, and it's great, and it's full of young people and families and people making artisan bread and young men with beards and so on. But there is nobody over 75 that you see on a Sunday afternoon.
Can I just come back and agree with the dissenting voice, if that's allowed? You said less dissenting, but no, I totally agree. And that's because if we have health as our end point, then actually we don't actually move the agenda on very much more, because I've got a lot of patients who have health at their end point because they've got a fairly empty life, and therefore the slightest blemish of their health and immediately go back to the surgery because they've got nothing else to fill it. But the end point has to be happiness, fulfillment, whatever other words you want to use, and health is a means to that.
Yes.
And I think I think you're totally right, and I don't like talking about 10,000 steps and 150 minutes and all that nonsense, because that actually is only a real kind of bit of a process business at the end. It shouldn't be a target, except for perhaps the middle class educated who want to have targets in their life and have all these spreadsheets. Most of us actually want to have a lovely time and enjoy life and don't care about so much health as long as it doesn't get in the way of playing with our grandchildren down in the park or having fun. So yeah, I totally concur with what you're saying.
I think that's a real challenge to us all. And if you separate your job and your life, then you start to talk different languages in each thing. And I think that's what really strikes me about what people said when I asked the question. They spoke about fun and connection and breathing and love of what they were doing and family and all of that. But then if I came to work the next day, I'd need to write that in a different language almost in order to get it through the channels that it needs to get through to be an advocate. And I think we need to change that. We need to start telling the stories in the workplace and in our policy documents and all of that speak to real life, instead of feeling like we've got to, like I said earlier, it's not even scientific research. Well, what is scientific research actually? And what those people are saying is really powerful and is all the stuff that you described. So we need to blur these boundaries of our language, don't we?
I think as well the language we speak, let's put this techie phrase, within health promotion, but the language William you will speak when you're prescribing something will be different from a friends group, for example. It'll be different from public health, it'll be different from an employer. And therefore, perhaps part of this is actually finding languages, as Gary said, it's very important, that relates to that constituency that you're responsible for. I don't think there's one language necessarily that we will all relate to, but there are language, and I think that's a really important point. How do we communicate, the goal of happiness and fulfilment through health in a way that our constituents, the people we come in contact with, can relate to. So I think that's a really important part of this debate.
And funders will investigate.
And I think that's one of the key points, isn't it? Absolutely. And I think there's we published a new strategy called Green Spaces for Good, and one of the opening lines of the strategy is parks quite simply make us happier. When as an organisation we can we completely stand by that as a statement. There was a fairly critical article published when we published our Revaluing Green Spaces piece in the Financial Times around what is this need to put a value on absolutely everything? Why do we have to do this? And I think we can. There was a criticism of that overall position of to put a price on everything, and our response to that very much was because we are trying to make an argument to a set of people, decision makers, funders, policy makers, who have set certain hoops for us to jump through, and therefore we are kind of all therefore in a position where we're trying to marshal our arguments and move our positions to be able to meet those targets, to be able to say, okay, so at the moment there isn't any funding for parks and green spaces because you can't quantify what the outcomes are. Let us try and quantify those outcomes in a way that fits into your balance sheet, that you'll be happy to create. But you're absolutely right. In the telling of that, then it's really important that we don't lose that very immediate impact that these spaces have on actual people, with real lives. In terms of what motivates them to use it.
I think it's a really difficult argument to win. I've sat in. Over the years, I've been in this business a long time, the ageing business a long time, and I've sat in countless presentations by brilliant projects who will demonstrate that if you spend £1 on doing this, that you will save however much it is somewhere else in the system, and 95% or maybe 99% of those projects never get any further because it's very difficult to shift funding in the health, social care and public sector from A to B, particularly in the last decade, as we know. So it is a balance of argument. I think you're right. It's a balance argument of public good, of preventive benefits, if you like, in the system. But I think what clinches it for me is the argument of green spaces, blue spaces, as being part of a place argument. These are better places to live for all of us. I think trying to prove the GVA, whatever it is, it's a really, or CVA, whatever the acronym is, a really difficult one to win in the rooms where money is allocated. I'm not saying we shouldn't argue for it because I do the same thing, but it is a really difficult argument at the moment.
So it feels to me there's very much a hearts and minds piece for individuals and communities, because actually everybody should access these places if it's making you happier. If we're happier, we live longer. Am I right, William? Generally, that's the way it works. So in that sense, but at the same time, there is a battle in the boardroom, so to speak, about actually how do you get the language right for there. And I suppose that's where the opportunity lies for everybody, really, because it feels very much like the conversation in those rooms is changing and a wider set of considerations are being factored in. And this should absolutely be part of that conversation because it can deliver a whole range of benefits. I was looking at the National Policy Planning Framework to kind of go, actually, what's in here? And we had a conversation earlier, didn't we, Richard, around this whole notion. If those planning documents are not only talking about the way that infrastructure and the environment is designed, but also promoting healthier communities and enhancing that natural environment, then surely there should be some kind of carrot and stick to that. It feels like there is very much a nice to-do list, or we should be trying to do this, and everybody wants to create these great spaces, but there isn't maybe there's no legislation that says you have to do it. Therefore, from a developer point of view, and I may be doing people a disservice, but actually it's easier to have smaller pathways in your community and less cycle routes because it's easier and it's quicker and it's more cost effective, etc. But actually, is there a point in time where we should be really challenging the people that make these local planning decisions to change the policy that actually affects the change? Because without it, it's nice to do them. That hearts and mind battle at a policy level is much trickier when you've got a planner with a bottom line of. I don't know if anyone got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent years in the planning sphere, so perhaps I can kick off on that one. Certainly the NPPF, the Planning Guidance, National Planning Policy Framework, was very useful for the guidance generally. And it identified clearly in a couple of paragraphs health and well-being related to urban space. It's very good. The first problem was it's only guidance. Okay. The second issue is that it rightly and well identifies sustainable development within a context of environmental, economic and social dimensions, and health comes into the social dimension. It then goes on to say that each should be dealt with equally. It doesn't define sustainable development, and therefore we're in a position where local authorities are caught wanting to do it without any clear teeth to do it with, because health is not a material consideration in the planning process, and therefore a developer doesn't have to meet a standard. And we've worked for developers for many decades. Many years, and there are some very good developers out there, that has to be said, and the staff within them want to do a good job. But unless there is a legal planning framework within which they are required to operate, which is one of the points you're making, there is no teeth to that policy. So I think if something that comes out of this discussion is, with the planners, how can that be improved? That's important. But I think that links across to, the planners will then say, what do we base that upon? And that goes back to the evidence that William was talking about earlier. Can we identify the evidence? Can we strengthen the evidence? And then can we then provide a framework within which that evidence can be delivered? It must be deliverable. And then we'll work on a few thoughts we've had on that down the road, perhaps. But I think those are the different dimensions. The third dimension is the recommendation in the public parks is not the requirement against the guidance that health and wellbeing boards should work more closely with local authorities. Okay, that's really important because that will begin to bring a holistic approach to the new development, refurbishment. But I think teeth is very important, and at some point I think by working together and providing the how-to, the measures that are required, the planners will then say, okay, it's not perfect yet, it's work in progress, as more research comes out, it'll be developed more. However, these are the criteria you want to look at. We've done some work on it, and Planning Association done some work, the Design Council have done some work on it. There's a lot of work beginning there, which is beginning to give people those, right, you need to do this, and that will end up as a more healthier environment than you would have had before. So I think we're far closer than we were. I think we're in range of actually getting there, but I think keep pushing. In all our spheres, keep pushing that.
Can I come in? Sure. With these conversations we're having right now here, with the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework and then obviously the local plans that will follow, and there is absolutely, like you described when we were at the Green Summit kind of engagement events earlier in the year, planners were saying, we want to do this, yes. But exactly as you've described, everything you've just said is the case, and I do think we've got a massive opportunity in Greater Manchester to do this. We're planning in the autumn to bring together around the active design concepts from with Sport England and Chris Boardman's work around global street design commitment and all that, to actually get people in the room in that holistic way that you're describing, so planners, developers, all together talking about, well, what would it take to achieve this, and how to go about that. So I just think there's a huge opportunity here to do that.
But there's intent.
Yes.
People want to do it.
Yes,
so,
absolutely. But they need the team.
10 years ago we had this discussion, I remember clearly, and then you said it'll take 10 years to come. But think of it, you were right.
And here we are.
But we're here. In fact, at 3:30 this afternoon.
I was going to say I think from that policy perspective, the NPPF obviously is absolutely vital to be able to achieve that, and that integration of health and wellbeing boards, and kind of the recommendation from the Select Committee Parks Inquiry to see more of that joined up work coming out of that process. So we're part of the work that's flown from the Select Committee, part of the Parks Action Group that was set up by MHCLG. And one of the real opportunities that we've seen, and that we hope kind of will come on stream further down the line, is the link with the new 25-year environment plan from DEFRA and the requirements within that plan to create green infrastructure standards. That again, there is an accountability there, and there is also a very clear, hopefully, framework that will be developed around both quantity of provision and quality of provision, and crucially future-proofing that provision, because I think that's one of the things that we really don't see at the moment in any of the existing frameworks. Is we can go through these iterative processes that will happen, at different milestones, and we can look at what the local plan will be at one point in time, and invariably, if we all look back at what that local plan looked like or its equivalent, 35 years ago, there'd be a lot less green space now than there was then, and so we've just kind of got this gradual erosion of how much green space we have within communities, and how do we make sure that we start to future-proof some of that space going forward. So I think that cross-departmental approach that's promised within the 25-year environment plan really shores up that cross-departmental approach that we all hope will continue to see through the DCMS strategy. But the presence and prevalence of parks and green spaces, informal spaces within both of those things, I think is really, really key.
Fascinating. William, did you want to?
I was just going to say, because all of this sort of background of trying to get into planning and health, etc., is absolutely essential. But you need fire in the belly of some of the leaders to actually take those risks. So you need both. Because otherwise, on itself, the kind of slightly dry, dusty spreadsheets won't do it. And if you look into the big cities that have really made massive difference, like Bogota. That was a mayor who said, we're going to make this place safe, because it's obviously crime-ridden, and he just broke all the rules and made it happen, and he did. And he closed all the streets on Sunday, and he just stopped all the roads and put them into parks and did crazy things. But it was because everyone was so fed up with the crime and everything else. And then in Copenhagen, it was because they had no money after the Second World War to actually do anything. And when everyone else built cars and roads and everything like that, and then when they did get some money, they looked around and saw what was being done in the rest of Europe and thought, we don't want to go that way. So that was by accident almost, and they both went. And in New York, Sadiq Khan, she said, I'm going to break the rules again, and I'm going to put up temporary things in Times Square and do it just for a weekend and then take it all down again. And all the taxi drivers went on strike and all the sort of things, but everyone loved it. And she got people on board, and she won the hearts and minds of the local people and was able to do more and more. And it's that kind of that social movement with a few leaders who can take that risk. And then you've got the infrastructure you have to have. You have to have these planning things, because there's got to be some legislation to kind of go behind it. But it's how do we get those leaders on board and get that far in there, and then get that social movement behind it. Because at the moment, if a park, people do look back at their parks and love it, but how much would they lie down on the road? How strong is it in people's minds?
I think that's a critical discussion. Parks are spaces for relationships between different people, relationships between different communities, social classes and ages and so on. It seems to me that the relational argument and the leadership argument, it's like for any agenda, is critical. I think we do have an opportunity in Greater Manchester because we've got a mayor who's well known, who is, I think, well liked, and who has got the fire in his belly, I think, to push forward a whole series of initiatives, and absolutely this one is part of that, I think. And I think it is then at the neighbourhood level, which really interests me. So as part of our Ambition for Ageing programme, which is a big lottery programme, £10 million, is we've got 25 neighbourhood sites for activity, which are kind of an emergent social movement of older people trying to change the places in which they live. Okay, and that's it. That's all they've been asked to do, really. And I think if you give people that kind of opportunity, you will start to then connect the different levels that people, mayoral leadership, the local authority leadership, and the community leadership. And all this has to be connected with a narrative, a story of how we want to change places. Right? And the language is one thing, but it has to be, that's the narrative that connects all the things up. Once you get that right, I think things will move.
I think, Yvonne, on the topic of the policy and planning framework, which is absolutely, I agree with all the sentiments people said about the policy framework, which is essential. We haven't touched on yet the competing demands, the strategic priorities that cities face, and the impact that those priorities may have on things like parks. So take Manchester, I know pretty well. We can't build schools quick enough. We can't build houses quick enough to keep up with the demand of people wanting to move into Manchester. So that doesn't mean we need to build schools on parks, God forbid, but because the planning and policy framework is essential to help manage this web of competing priorities. Because what happens when you build more homes, you build more schools, you need more parks. So it's an absolute challenge to overcome the competing priorities. And then if we sit here, we've had these sorts of workshops, what does 50 years' time look like? And we're going, if you know geography in these parks, Hinton Park, which is one of the largest parks in Europe, could be a city centre park.
That's what we're thinking. It's even okay. Transport infrastructure. Well, that is, how does the city grow? Because it's growing at an unbelievable rate today. Well, is that going to happen? Is Heaton Park in Bury, on the border of Bury, going to be Greater Manchester City Centre Park? Maybe it is. You can certainly see in the next 10 years Alexandra Park in Kew becoming the city centre park because the city is growing that way. So Etihad Campus is becoming on the edge of the city centre. The city is doing this, and land is incredibly difficult to find to build things on. We build stuff and we need more parks. So you've got these competing priorities. The policy framework becomes even more important as major cities are suffering these competing priorities. In clarity, the boldness of the leaders is essential. Because they will, let's just break the rules. If I break those rules, am I affecting a priority over here? So the clarity of the vision and the clarity of the strategy about the place is absolutely essential.
I think the argument that we would put from this is, can we make roots health as part of that discussion? Because certainly having lived in my planning landscape silo for many years, it wasn't until I went to the Masters in Public Health at Liverpool and actually started seeing what health was for local communities, the impact of it, that I think we've got to change this, and somehow we have to break down silos, not just in terms of financing, but in terms of identity, in terms of understanding. And we've got to break eggs to do that, perhaps. But let's find Jeff, make some good omelettes.
It is also really important not to just, if we talk about routes through places. When you describe how the city's growing, then we need to think about how people move around the space. And as someone who kind of walks and cycles around Manchester and out to Etihad campus and things, it could be so much better, couldn't it? That could be a really pleasant experience. It is great, but not many people are doing it. So I think we have got an opportunity as well as the city grows and we're filling in gaps and space, thinking about how they link together. And trees down along the streets and things that for people who aren't going to go to a park yet, hopefully, make a decision to go to a park, how about they happen on it by chance? Because that's the nicest, easiest, quickest, most logical way from A to B, and along the way, this is a nice space. So it's that kind of thing, rather than thinking of them as separate entities.
Does that thinking also mean that, therefore, and this is always controversial, is that actually, if you live in a really large park, is there any reason why you can't build in the middle of it? So public services where people can go, so surgeries or schools or something like that, in a park, but green space,
community.
But people have this sort of black and white view that says nothing could be built, not an inch is going to be taken away, but actually it will make that park come to life by doing it sensibly.
William, I imagine the social prescribing that would come out from that if the surgery was there in the middle of the park. Come back to me when you walk around and I'll have another chat with you.
And that's a really interesting point, because if a park has a set of restricted covenants to prevent you from doing what you've just said, but you can totally see the tangible benefits of developing in a space that you're not allowed to develop, then you've got to break the rules. So who lets us break the rules? When you're holding this park in trust of the purpose it was given, and you think, I can deliver with that purpose, but you've got to let me.
Pop-up GP surgeries.
Let's find a way. There will be the way in which to be found.
And you might try and break the rules, but then people will have something to say. People generally get behind something when something's under threat. So I'm thinking about the whole Sheffield tree thing. Do you think about that? All being cut down, and then there's people honking trees and lining the road, and something coming out. And I don't know how many they saved or what policies, but it was national news, and so how do we get the fire in the belly before threatened? Now it may be that it's trying to break the rules, and then you have the big community argument about why it's a good thing versus not. Also think about the Alexandra Park refurbishment, a load of community engagement with that for right or wrong reasons. Presumably, I'm hoping, I don't know the details, a better outcome from that for everybody. Certainly community involvement and ownership of that park came from it, and you see the strength. So there's something around communities galvanising around a problem or a threat, and we need to get that.
It's awareness as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
A real, there is, in general terms, there's very little comprehension amongst the general public around the fact that parks and green spaces are not a statutory function. And that's kind of an ongoing challenge, I think, for everybody to try and create that grassroots approach to try and get communities to really understand and engage and find out how they want to use these spaces and how these spaces can be designed and delivered in a way that's more useful to them individually and their own needs. Because the case in Knowsley Metropolitan Borough Council that's got an awful lot of coverage in the past few months, where they made a proposal to sell 17 of their parks and green spaces, the idea being that would create a fund that would then be an endowment that would fund the remainder of the portfolio, because they literally had no budget left for this non-statutory function to be able to create it. And at the local election there was a change in leadership. The public reacted really strongly. The new leadership have now revoked that decision and have committed in their manifesto to creating a positive future for those spaces. So you see that level of community engagement, but I think you're absolutely right. It happens so much for us as an organisation. We get contacted at the point that a park or green space is under threat. It's been identified as something that's possibly it's underused. One of the best ways to keep a space is to use it and to find ways that a community wants to use it. And I think that's a really important thing. I think on the restrictive covenants point, that was one of the major recommendations from the Parks Inquiry, was that hands were being tied in a way that wasn't necessarily always practical or pragmatic, and that local authorities needed to be assisted to remove restrictive covenants where it made sense to do so that more innovative ideas could be trialled and taken forward. And that would be some of the sort of ideas we've heard about. How do you create hubs? How do you put more social enterprise into spaces? How do you kind of just create a different model and an alternative model to both running and funding a space that isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all. You're not going to have one template, you go, okay, this is what we do now, this is 21st century parks, but different versions of that.
It's going to take some innovation as well as I live in the National Park, and the Men Down Mountains campaign that the National Parks do with the DMC is really interesting because people really care about the origins of the National Park movement and the democratisation of that open spaces. So crowdsourcing as a way of, maintaining the national park trails and things is a pretty new thing. And it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about different ways of thinking, more innovative ways of thinking about how we resource this and who cares about this enough to invest when the recipient might be somebody else. And I think that's what's starting to happen with the national parks. How successful it'll be on the grand scale of the challenge, obviously, is another question. But it's good to see some different thinking.
Yeah, fascinating. Next phase of the discussion, really, I'm interested to understand, assessing, I guess, the qualities for health around parks. Are there particular models that people would use that would be recommended both nationally or at a local level? How are you creating that argument to say that, a park delivers all of these outcomes at a local level, taking on board, obviously, some of the work that you've talked about, Helen, in terms of the report, and there may be things that you want to pick up from that, and then look more specifically, in a locality. Is it happening? If it's not, why not? Helen, I don't know if you'd like to start off with that.
Well, it's very early days for us having only published this report last month, and it has within the report headline figures around the wellbeing value that's created by a park or green space. So the overall wellbeing value created by parks and green spaces being used frequently, so more than once a month, is estimated to be £34 billion a year according to our research. And obviously what we hope is that that's something that then people can use to apply to individual parks and green spaces. So for us, one of the motivators for doing this research was to look at it from an individual level. So how do you kind of quantify what the benefits are of a park or green space to an individual who uses that space? So very much kind of a personal approach to looking at the value piece. So we looked at the wellbeing value and we looked at the economic value. So using the approach that's been taken for other for other studies, looking at how do you put a value on something that doesn't have a cost. So looking at how libraries have been valued, looking at how museums have been valued, and doing something that's treasury consistent, because that was really important to us, that we would end up with something that we felt was robust enough to stand up to scrutiny, and that we would be in a position that we were helping to create, hopefully, a tool or a principle that could be applied by lots of other stakeholders, to be able to say, if you have an individual park or green space and you can draw a buffer zone as to, okay, we're going to say there's a 1 kilometre buffer zone around an individual space, and we're going to look at the population in that buffer zone, we're going to look at what the ethnic makeup is, we're going to look at whether or not they fall into a lower or higher socioeconomic group, and we're going to have something that's welfare weighted in terms of that approach. And that welfare weighting is a really important point for us, because other studies that had been done previously that were similar didn't take into account those differences. And some of the really interesting findings from our report are really coming through that weighting piece and being able to look at the nuances between lower socioeconomic groups and BAME communities, assigning a value to parks and green spaces that's so much higher than the national UK average. So almost double and almost treble. And that's not necessarily something that we'd expected to see. I think that it's interesting when you look at that in combination with the fact that both of those groups are seen as the lowest users of those spaces, and yet they value them more highly, potentially because of a lack of disposable income to use other spaces. So that kind of that free at the point of access model was an important point for us. I think it's really interesting to look at how that work then can apply to individual spaces, to individual authorities. But I think what's really important is that we move towards something that's adopted on a national basis. And that's some of the work again that we're looking at with MHCLG. There's lots of work around natural capital accounting and being able to assign a value to individual spaces and what value do they generate. And obviously that's much more all-encompassing of all of the environmental benefits and things that we've looked at. It does put an awful lot of emphasis on house prices being generated through good access to good quality green space, and that's why our perspective was a slightly different one. What we're hearing from parks managers is that they want to have something that is recognised, that they can give to the accountant, that they can say, okay, this is a way that we can model and value our parks and green spaces, something that we can put in our return. We can show that this is what it's costing us to run these spaces, and this is the value of the benefits that are being generated by it. And I think what we'd like to see is something that combines all of those methodologies to give a sort of a 360 view of what are all the benefits that's adopted by all local authorities. So everybody's looking at this position of saying, okay, I've got this many parks and green spaces, this is the budget that we have to maintain them, but equally this is what we think that they're generating, to be able to put a different slant on how that's viewed. I think at the moment, and I think it's something that Paul referred to earlier, there's lots of other models that are out there in terms of Edinburgh have done loads of work on the return on investment for their parks and green space strategy, showing a return of £12 on every £1 spent. There's been quite a lot of work done in Sheffield on a similar methodology, and I guess it's trying to get to a point, I think, that's crucial, that there's some kind of consistency that can be used across all authorities to be able to look at that piece in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Lee, from your point of view on a locality basis, I mean, how do you, within the city, kind of assess parks from a wider outcome point of view, but also from a health perspective as well, or does that happen?
The argument amongst us is we don't need to almost have to have it because it's one.
That's a nice position.
It is a very fortunate.
Yeah.
I say fortunate because fortunate on the basis that clear vision, clear strategy, strong. Whatever your political persuasion, a Labour council that's been Labour for many, many years is stable. Decisions are taken very quickly. Things get done because of that sort of stability. We've got 144 parks. It costs us £3 million. We generate £700,000 off all of those parks, and 84% of that investment, the return, comes from 2 parks.
Yeah.
So the business model for 144 parks, it's crucial that those 2 parks deliver an economic strategy that sustains 144. Yeah. We don't want to get rid of any parks or open space, playing field, a park, blue space, they are different. And sometimes when we say park, it triggers a thought that they're the same, and they're not, because it's really also useful to consider other sectors and what are other sectors doing. Can we learn anything? So a closed sector, but still different, say indoor leisure. And we use this phrase, inch wide and mile deep, like to talk about an economic strategy. Inch wide being sell gym memberships and sell swimming lessons, and drive that strategy as deep as you can, because that's where you'll get a commercial return to have a sustainable facility infrastructure. Because if you don't do that, the whole system fails. So you've got to have a very strong commercial focus in that sector around that strategy to be able to do so much more. So is that possible in parks? Well, possibly, but it has to be with a note of caution. If Heaton Park and Wythenshawe Park, that are the 2 parks I'm talking about, do not have a really vibrant and strong commercial strategy, parks will fail, 144. But you've got to balance the economic and commercial strategy on those 2 with what those parks are also for, and parks for everyone. So the balance in that challenge has got to be carefully thought through, because the whole system is reliant on 2.
And Richard, in your kind of experience, this whole notion of assessing parks for health, do you feel that happens at a wide scale, or are the things that could be done that aren't being done? If we looked at Greater Manchester and the opportunity that Manchester could do, and other places in the country, on a wider footprint, that would really help to create the picture of what do all of those parks look like. You've got 144. I live in Greater Manchester. Do I know those 144 and what that offer would be to me and my family? I don't. How could I find that out? And then, from your point of view, William, and if you knew that park delivered that versus that park delivered that, you might be more specific and bespoke and relative to the individual, who might then sustain that activity more because it's better tailored to them. I mean, does that exist?
I think not yet in the detail that we would hope. There are a couple of things we're exploring. Value thoughts on this is that the first is what we're beginning to call the sort of park health strategy framework. Okay, so imagine a situation in which this discussion has been had. We're 10 years on again, and things are moving forward. The picture I get then is you have the parks seen consciously as health assets, working with parks, having an objective assessment model that you can assess them for health based on the evidence, And that feeds into partnerships, we touched on earlier, with social prescribers, CCGs, with charities, with public health, with employers, because they will save money if their people are fit and healthy as well, but focused on parks. And so that is sort of the overview. And that's also linked with what Hannah was saying, in the sense that evaluation of changes, I think, is very important. So we're in discussion, obviously, with Deborah De Silva, the Evidence Centre, and putting together assessment models. How do you actually evaluate both health benefits, quantitative and qualitative, and what's the economic evaluation of that? Okay, so that's the sort of the overview of an integrated package, if you will, a strategy framework. In terms of the detail, again, perhaps because I haven't come from public health, I can break a few eggs. And where we started on this was to say, okay, how do we create health-promoting environments? And we went right back to the evidence base and started drawing out from the evidence base what are the characteristics that have been demonstrated through research to be positive for health. And 250 papers later, we've come up with a model that does that. And so I think it's an integration. It's first important to have a perception, which we touched on. But secondly, then to actually say, how do we deliver on the ground? Because as practical landscape architects used to delivering on the ground, if these discussions continue in terms of policy and aspiration, that's good. But actually, what it means, models that we're working on will be, the basic audit will be free for communities to use. It means that it'll give a measure of different aspects of health, but also it'll identify in lists actual interventions that you can do for individual parks and how they can be evaluated. And so it's trying to both have the strategy, it's having the champions at the top to drive it strategically, but also answer the question how, and how can we galvanise local communities to engage with their park. Not having people coming in from the top or consultants coming in and telling them what to do. No, this is your park. Here's the tool for you to do it. This is how you can do it, and these are the benefits you'll get. And part of that is social prescribing. I don't know how you feel, William, that would fit within.
Yeah, but I think when you're winning people over, you're right. There's almost three things. One of them is actually economic. And we have to be careful on economic because there's been a lot of debate about actually what counts and what doesn't. So we're doing some work in Manchester. You can look at what a death counts as, because if you do the heat model of how many people are walking, every death is valued at 3 million or something. Suddenly you get £55 million saved by, but nobody really believes it, and nobody actually, what does it mean? And then you can do quality adjusted life years and public health like that. But actually, what does that mean to the bottom line of CCG? It doesn't at all. What does it mean to the bottom line of anybody? It's just added health value. Then you come to actually how many diabetics you're going to prevent. That gets much more interesting. But the trouble is, the more you go into that, the more you can be actually kind of shot down and say that figure's not accurate, that doesn't, and then eventually the argument kind of withers away, and you have to be careful. So the other part is then the method. How do parks work? How does it work that you get a park and it has health? So that's why I go into my telomeres and mitochondria and things, and people say, okay, if I can see that mechanism, that makes scientific sense. So there's a logic behind that. And that really, and of course there's a narrative in the hearts and minds, which is probably the main way of stories of where you're going to get the influence. So I think you need all three to develop it. I think if each individual one can be shot down quite easily, but put them all together in a package and you get that strength.
And I think building on that perhaps is that if we can get the passion in the local communities for their parks through local CCGs and GPs, obviously, who see more than most of us, and then say, and this is how you do it, and it addresses, we can address accessibility, health promotion initiative, mental well-being issues, physical activity, environmental things. These can all be assessed, and then that community and their representatives can decide, okay, for us in this community with a diabetes problem, with an obesity problem, with a social problem, which of these options do we want to engage with? And working together, with GPs, for example, and public health and local groups, you begin to get a holistic approach, which is practical and can be implemented, but leaves the decision-making and the power with the community. And I think that's important. So we're trying to sort of bake the eggs from the other direction. How can we actually start with a community-based model and then link with the other strategies, as we discussed right at the beginning, that have been developing over the last 10 years to make those changes on the ground. And I think that we're in danger of getting it, of actually all of us working together to deliver something which could be very good.
So obviously, Richard, you've talked there about the opportunity to really crystallise how parks are assessed, and in particular you started to move toward this notion of people taking ownership and really developing, and I guess coming to you, Hayley, around this notion of real community-centred approaches. That comes, I don't know, maybe a challenge around additional resource to really get in and understand those communities, and also agility to be able to react to what the communities need. So I just wondered if you got any thoughts on how we might use more people in local communities to support perhaps the assessment of these parks for health benefits. If those tools exist and they're straightforward and easy to use, is there a way that people in localities could help the system to understand better what those parks can do for people, which then enables the conversation and the evidence to kind of go further up the tree?
I think it comes back to changing the narrative though again about what matters to people. So not asking them to put that in our boxes or in our language. So understanding what you can see, what you can feel, what people want out of a space and in their lives. And people don't think about life, do they, in boxes. So we're particularly talking here about parks and open spaces, but people don't see the world like that. So I think the challenge to us in that is it comes back to being place-based, so having conversations with people in communities about what matters to them, and then being able to respond to the passion, energy that bubbles up quickly, and to be able to enable people to get on with the things that they're bothered about. So it comes back to all our community neighbourhood working and our ways of doing that in a really joined up way, and not going, well, we're leisure, or we're sport, or we're ageing, or we're this, or we're that. Let's just talk to people in a place, and when they come up with ideas, let's help them bring them to fruition, and not expect them to work in our ways. And there's loads of examples where it's happening already, but we need to make it just a consistent way of working across the whole of Greater Manchester, and let people take control of their own destinies.
I think I absolutely agree with that. I think the other kind of part of the equation is that we have to show people examples of what other people have achieved as well, and what is possible. Because if you go to a restaurant, you don't know what's on the menu. You're struggling, aren't you? And I think if we can show, and this is a challenge to all of us, but to Helen and her colleagues, is to bring forward these, and we were talking about Alex Park, to bring forward these examples where people have transformed, not the park, but the community in which the park has been part of the story. And I think if we can, create a platform for those stories, neighbourhood stories, individual stories, organisational stories, and connect those up, then I think, you've got a chance, haven't you?
When I just think in my own life, sort of probably 12, 13 years ago, we did a community planning process, which wasn't divided up into boxes of, talk to people about what matters to them in their community. When I think about the journey we've been on there over that period of time, there's still new things starting and still new ideas coming through now that probably rooted back in those initial conversations then. But they spin off in all different directions. So I was just mentioning about boot camp in the pub garden. That's a new thing, but it wouldn't be happening if we hadn't had those conversations then and created an environment in which it was possible to have an idea and then do that thing. And being able to see, like say, what other people have done down the road, albeit it might be different, but to dare to dream a little bit about what's possible is a big thing. But we in the public sector need to change our ways of working to make that happen.
Question, what you look at. In terms, it's easy for us to look at an organisation, Manchester Council, whatever, and say yes, the structures are in place. But is there at least a similar network at a community level in terms of who you talk to, who the motivators are there? Is that work in place, or is that already known?
There are always people that it's finding them and being working at that level where you will find the people.
Is that part of the Manchester vision?
Yeah, I mean it's very much a part of our whole way of working and philosophy, isn't it? And it's not everywhere yet, but I mean, I don't know if you can describe some of the...
I think it's a difficult challenge, and it is the structures in communities are nowhere near as defined as organisational at all. But certain types of people in certain communities, and you're the go-to, your champions. But then you also have a note of caution to go to, well, that community group or that group of residents aren't the voice for all residents.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to like, okay, but so you've got to try to find as many different types of resident groups. That even in a residents group, they might not feel they're represented by all of their group. So, to try and satisfy everyone's need is always a challenge, but so you can't just assume that one friends group speaks for the residents of that community. Because take Cheetham Hill as an area, something like 91 languages are spoken in this country, and all 91 are spoken in Cheetham Hill. So, there's only two places in England, it's one of the boroughs the same. So if you're parking Cheetham Hill, or that area, how are you going to make sure that park is representative of that community? Yeah. That is an incredible challenge, and there are community structures that you would work within, but mindful that you might not be representative of that whole community.
Yeah. I suppose what comes to mind, for my sake, it's useful to know the social prescribed model, I understand, has in a sense a community coordinator within it. Is that right? And are they the sort of catalyst for these kinds of initiatives? Or?
Yes, they are, whatever you call them, an activator, navigator,
whatever.
But they are readily the kind of translator of that person whose needs have to be addressed, and they say what they want to do, and therefore that navigator should understand and know everything out in that community that's available. And normally it's kind of curtailed to a certain number of tried and tested kind of community models rather than just absolutely everything. So there has to be a little bit of kind of governance on it. But yes, you have got that. And I think what, from a discussion sometimes, and actually I was taken by Andy Burnham's kind of what Chris Borden had told him about, you've got to have a double buggy going down every path, and every cyclist has got to be equivalent to having a 12-year-old being safe to do it. Now if you think about vision and success in those terms, that's universal, cuts across all cultures. Because everyone wants their child to be out, everyone wants their child. And I think there's some universal kind of language on family and thing which actually does, you don't need to ask everybody, because everybody wants their children to be healthy and happy. Everyone wants peace and quiet to be able to have their older generation to be able to. So those things are kind of universal, and I think and a lot of this is sharing the vision of, if we have a strong vision of what we want the place to look like, everyone can put their own interpretation of it, but it's very relevant to them. And this whole communication, I've already said it earlier, about getting the language right, but it's also getting the vision right. That it's something that you can say, that means we can go for a picnic, and whether it's a Hindu picnic or whether it's a Muslim or whatever it is, different cultures, it's the same thing. So for a social prescribing, going back to that point, that person would be able to understand hopefully the needs of the individual, and then just be able to direct them out because they really understand what's available.
This is just reminding me of a part of consultation, and whenever we consult as an authority on anything, parks and leisure always return the most response. Forget more than the budget consultation, more than parks and leisure, and through that consultation work we got to certain community groups, and we were talking about walking and cycling, and that was coming out loud and clear. Create those opportunities, but then when we talk to some certain groups of individuals, they say, well, don't encourage us to walk. I was thrown completely by that comment. Why? Well, in our culture, walking has a certain status to it. If you walk, it means you haven't got a car. Yeah. So we won't walk. So we will get in our car and go 100 yards down the road to buy the groceries from the shop. So okay, but walking is good for you. So we need to walk in a group. So we feel safe. So if you balance that with someone that wants to be alone and walk privately and quietly, and then you've got the needs of trying to walk in a group so you feel safe. You have into the tensions that could create. I completely agree with what you're saying, but there's a layer beneath that as well. And if we're not getting to almost that granular level of understanding, we make policy, and it might be wrong.
Yeah.
Because it's there's that unintended consequences.
Perhaps a way of consulting on something is not about what do we need to do with this park, but asking people what they want to be different. So it may be that I'm new to an area and don't know anyone, or it may be that I'm isolating somewhere, I just need to meet people. So then what can help me do that? Well, the park might be a means, and then how do we... So framing instead of what we're doing at the park, but what our people need to do. And then actually, if I'm passionate enough or I get some help, I might be able to start something to make the person who's just started the boot camp from the pub. And it might be the pub landlord, but it might just be that someone doesn't want to drive 5 miles to the nearest boot camp somewhere, and right, I'll kickstart some things. You've got some ideas, and you can use the barrel cakes. And so it's not necessarily from someone who's organised, but from my own personal need, and I'm connected on social media, or there's other people who are new to this area, and actually find the thing that galvanises people, and then the park comes into the space.
So what we're trying to do with the work around GM Moving and is to vision what, not that all neighbourhoods would be the same, but what are the ingredients in a neighbourhood that are going to enable this change that we want to see in this social movement, and the social prescribing only really works if you've got real rich assets and opportunities and offers within the community, and they need to connect. So you've got to look at it in a holistic way at the neighbourhood level, and help to build both those things up so that your community connector, or whoever they are, or community champion, or whatever, actually has something to talk about when someone says, well, I'm lonely. Well, actually, if you're lonely, what do you feel like doing? Like, there's all these things going on. How can we handhold you, buddy, peer support, whatever, to access this thing that's going on in your community? So it's a whole approach. You can't just do one thing, can you?
Which leads us nicely on, I guess, to the final question, effectively I want to pose, which is about that integration thing. It's come through really strongly, naturally actually throughout this whole conversation, which is, how do we take it to the next level, both collectively as a group of people here committed to this agenda, with an interest in this agenda, and actually with some really valuable contributions, but also to the people that are going to be watching this. How do they start to take this conversation and make it part of a much bigger conversation within a locality, whilst being informed in that conversation by people in those communities who will benefit, so the beneficiaries you talked about earlier. I don't know if anybody would like to sort of offer their thoughts.
So, it's about how we build, and for me, it's central to all this. The biggest resource we have is the narrative story that we tell about what we're trying to achieve, the vision thing, the examples that we illustrate it with, the people who we give a platform to, and how we integrate the story of parks or green and blue spaces with a broader story about how we want to change the places in which we live and who's involved in that and so on. I have a particular interest in older people. I thought Lee's story about the car and walking is absolutely illustrative of the assumptions that we can't make, and that why getting your hands dirty at a local level, being embedded in communities, creating the partnerships between the communities and the places in which people live is absolutely the answer to this. And the rest of us have to create and curate those relationships and opportunities for people to change where they live. And once you do that, the work and what you presented in terms of the economic argument and so on start to make sense more profoundly than if you start off somewhere else, I think. Which, so for the last thing I'll say, I guess, is from the age perspective, there's two key points. One is that as people get older, they're less likely to use. Their motivations are in part the same as young people to get out and about and want to do things. But the footpaths aren't great. The transport doesn't respond. If they want to get to the local park, you have to build in all the other things as well for people to get there. And the other thing is the issue of inequality. So we have 50,000 pensioners in Greater Manchester who are officially poor. And we have to think specifically about those groups and how we speak to them and involve them in the news, because they've got the most to gain actually from this agenda. Yes, it's difficult, but it's energising, you know. The thing about these multi-agency relationships is that they're energising and exciting. You know, being stuck in your own organisation, doing the same thing year after year, it's repetitive, it's boring. So getting out and about and having these conversations is really important.
I'll just add one thing about social prescribing as well on this, because actually social prescribing is only an interim solution. The health service is not a great way of delivering this type of community. In fact, it's hopeless part of it, because it keeps on going back to the medical model. That's the one it's built on, so that's the structure. Everything revolves around that. So in order to get social prescribing through the door, it's got to be based on a medical process. So you get the referral to a specialist, who's a navigator, and that navigator refers you on to the deliverer, which is the provider, rather, does the community. And everyone gets that, and it's a nice, easy thing to fund, and there's some sort of sense in it. But actually, it's really an efficient way of delivering it, because it's one person on one, and you've got a mass of people out there who need it. So in parallel to that, we've got to think at the next level, which is actually the community taking this on. There's no reason why you have to have a prescription from a doctor. It's ridiculous, or a health professional. So that's part of the reason why we're doing Beat Street. That's a mass participation of getting tens of thousands of people who started. Some of them are going to be fine, but an awful lot of them are captured who actually got needs, and that the community deliver it. And that's just one example. But eventually, the social prescribing will actually be community delivered and curated and sorted out, and governance will be within the community. But we're not there yet, and it's too early to deliver that and get NHS funding, because nobody has a clue how to fund it and what they're meant to be doing. But that pathway is already being done. I was giving some evidence to the MPs yesterday, and already they were saying about personal budgets for long-term conditions and social prescribing going through that mechanism. So you bypass the doctor and the healthcare, and you go straight to the community provider. And I think that thinking's there, but they agree that this is this journey. And parks, for example, would then benefit from a much bigger upside and swelling, hopefully, of funding coming through as well.
Well, do you mind me? Because I understand absolutely the argument you make around social prescribing. There's a kind of I see a danger in it though, is that there's a risk that the kind of language around and the approach taken by certain point system further kind of pathologises the opportunities that should be created in communities, the relationships and for taking action and all the rest of it. They then become attached to a kind of biomedical process. And I guess that's because I think there's loads of great stuff out there that can be linked into, if you like, the social prescribing model. But in a way, I think sometimes the tail's wagging the dog. And I think that's my concern about the kind of social prescribing kind of paradigm or language.
I think that's what we're trying to do here, isn't it? Is to take a more holistic view of. Actually, we prescribe each other all the time. It's just having conversations and encouraging each other to step out of the door and go for a walk. You know, when you think about your friends, your family, community, you don't call it social prescribing, but that's essentially what we're doing. So I think we need to create the conditions in which we have, obviously, the clinical end of it. And Andy Burnham mentioned this yesterday about, it's clinical and it's community, and it's how you do all of that at the same time, and how you enable those conversations to happen at community level. And there's some great examples of it already. And sometimes it started from the family practice, and sometimes it's working the other way. But yeah, I agree. It's
a good exercise is saying, how would you make this work with zero budget?
Absolutely.
And then you actually get the real answers. You get the really exciting innovations and communities coming up and people doing it. It's very good. The budget tends to kind of divert people's attention very often.
That's one reason why we're trying to make the initial audit free. Because it goes to the community. You do it for your business. There's no vested interest. You can do it. They can build on it later. But without breaking that model, because we've got to get around this, there isn't any money, there isn't any money, there isn't any money. There is. So it's got to come in at the right time. There are brilliant experts who can help, but getting to the community is the key.
Going back to inequalities again, though, it comes. You were asking earlier about what exists in communities. It is very different in different places. Sometimes you've got social capital to staring you in the face, you know, it's easy, and another times it's going to take longer to find that there are always the people, but they won't be sitting on committees in, you know, the Women's Institute or the Community Association or whatever. But I mean, you hear really interesting ways that people find those people. And again, you've got to be out, like you say, getting your hands dirty in the community to even have a hope of that. I think the other big thing, going back to your initial question, is it's got to be person and community centred, and organisations, with all of their ambitions and, you know, aspirations to help, need to really think about people and communities first, and not the needs of their organisation in this. And that's really hard. That is really, really hard.
I think my start point on this is parts in public ownership, part because to enable public scrutiny. That's kind of like my start point. Local authorities, guardians of the community, if you like. I said, however, we need to take a different approach with partnerships, because in my view, the way that we'll make a success, and starting with no money type of principle, is through the partnerships we create. And then I think, okay, well, who are the biggest public funders out there? Local authorities, health, or England. Are we talking collectively, as those three public funders, about the sustainability of parks? Probably not enough at all. And we've got to balance that with the colliding strategic priorities of places. And then so partnerships between sporting and local authority and health, you've got to add in the community. So the partnerships that you can develop, result that public investment potential, the partnerships with the community, because the answer is in the community. Balance that with public scrutiny of what you're doing. So that's provides me a framework, and certainly is what the Manchester Council is doing with that sort of framework. And that approach is, you know, the good news is we're about to invest over the next term of the strategy £20 million investment in parks, in addition to what it costs to run them. So, you know, so there's good news out there, but there's so much more to do, so much more to really create the ideas from the community, because each park, as we've talked about, is different for a different place. You've got to be mindful of that one.
Nick, can I just ask, in terms of the funders as well, and going back, I suppose, to the starting point of this discussion around when the Victorian philanthropists or whatever it was, spent lots of money on. You know, what's the role of the private sector, of corporate social responsibility, of philanthropic organisations? Because those actors enter into discussions right across the public sector about the partnerships we can build. How do they figure in these discussions?
Well, private sector, they make money.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be thought of as a dirty word. How do we create an opportunity for the private sector to make money out of assets if that money can go back into the assets and help make it sustainable? So that's not meaning you're giving away the asset. It is so take Heaton Park, because here we are, £3 million it costs us to run, and something like 74% of the return comes from Heaton Park, of all parks.
The concerts.
Yeah, so there's concerts, and there's Treetop Trek. So it's organisations like that to come in and make money, which means we can put it back into the park. And that's how we got, through any type of commercial discussion with our residents, it's about, if we're able to do this, we'll so, and that's the public scrutiny bit, because if we don't have that public scrutiny,
Rather than we'll sell the park.
Yeah, that's it.
So you can balance the need of the private sector to help, because they need to make money, because if they don't make money, they're not going to put it back in the park. So you've got to strike the right fine balance between the two.
You mentioned about Sheffield and this endowment idea, which I know has been going around. So if you've got £1 million revenue, you've got 700,000 at the moment. So
that's it. Comes to
to $1 million, you'd have 2 million left to make per year. What kind of endowment would be needed? What kind of sum would be needed to create an endowment for 2 million a year forevermore? 50 million, 100 million, or whatever it is?
Yeah.
Have people been, I know the National Trust is involved with that and trying to get some ideas of getting that endowment for each local area. Has that been thought through?
I think it has. I think there is still some work going on. That came out of the Rethinking Parks project that was National Trust and Nesta. And that Sheffield model, there was an awful lot of investment in terms of time and resource to be able to say, okay, is this something that could be created that is a new model to the endowment model? And it was looking to bring, to create a consortium of funders to create that endowment that would fund the parks on an ongoing basis, that would bring the contribution from all of the major employers in Sheffield and looking at what kind of contribution would be needed. And I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but I think that the gap between where they could get to and what actually would be needed to generate that £2 million return or whatever it might have been was fairly significant. I think that the principle of the endowment model remains kind of a live concept that Heritage Lottery and National Trust and other organisations are continuing to explore. And I think it will be interesting to see what the outcomes are from the Newcastle model, which was sort of developed in parallel at the same time as the Sheffield piece was going on. So where Newcastle have shifted a significant number of their parks into a trust model. Not every single one of the parks, so it depended on certain factors, to enable them to seek alternative funding streams. So by shifting them into the trust model, they are looking for local people to make donations. They're looking for people to run challenge events to raise money for the local parks and green spaces. They're looking to apply to trusts and foundations. They're looking at all kinds of different funding streams that weren't open to them as a local authority, things that they couldn't go out and look to secure. And it would be interesting to see what returns are generated from that. So the idea that then that's ring fenced for the parks that are in the parks that have remained within the local authority, again, remains to be seen as that struggle, because much like the Manchester model, there's often a few of those parks that will be the ones that generate the income, because it's not specific. It's not possible for all of them. It's not possible for all of them to have a car park, to run a nursery, to do these large-scale events, to do those things that mean there can be some reinvestment. So some of those models and different kind of changes to ownership and management, I think we're going to see more of. It was another recommendation from the inquiry as to how can things be managed differently. There's obviously a long lead time to be able to see what the results are and where it works. It's not replicable in each place. And there's other models where they're looking at much more asset transfer into the local community, so giving them a much more active role in the running of parks and green spaces, which in places with social capital will be a successful move, but it's not something that can be.
It's still hard. The irony of it is the places with the social capital are less able to attract investment from trusts and charities because they're the least in need, is my experience. So kind of got this weird situation going on there where you potentially create a bit of a problem for yourself.
And I think it's where we have to learn from other sectors. And not learn, because what works in one sector does not necessarily work in another, but Manchester's success is cool, that's a bit of a headline without the detail, if you like, but it's been built on public-private partnerships. And the one that springs to mind that's been hugely successful was the ETF campus. Why has that been such a success? Because we had a really bold vision at a time when the city was not as successful as it is today. And we want the city said we want something better for ourselves than what we've got. That's big for an Olympic Games, type of story. And the private partnership was the City Council, Sport England and Manchester City Football Club. And remember, at the time of Manchester City Football Club, we were in the 3rd division. Not where they are now. So there was no rich foreign owners. It was because we shared a vision for the place. And what's happening at 18, 16 years on from the Games, we're still investing huge sums of money into the development of that campus for the benefit both nationally and locals. But it doesn't mean it's the right model. So let's look at models from all different types of sectors and think what might work. And in some cities it might be the right solution, in other cities it won't be. So there is no one size fits all. Definitely.
And also it'll be, you need to adapt it to every local situation.
Absolutely.
But I'm sure there must be principles that can be built on and adapted. But I think what's nice about hearing what you're saying is that it's we can look at all these years past. We're the local authority, and then we can't look at those. We're now saying, just break that down. But we can look at all these, which creates a really positive context. to explore ideas, because people say, well, I've got a good idea, great, let's pursue it. So that's very positive.
Fantastic, thank you very much for your contributions. If I was to summarise kind of the discussion as we've gone on, I think there are a number of things that have come out very strongly for me. I think one which you raised, William, was the whole people, purpose, nature, place, that whole notion. And creating that health promoting environment is something that we all want, it's something everyone will benefit from. But to do that, the terminology, the language, the approach, asset-based, happiness, turn it into that kind of conversation makes it much more engaging for so many of our communities and individuals. We're all motivated by that. I think this notion that parks are they're spaces to create relationships is very, very powerful actually. And I think it's often underplayed because we're going, well, we need to create an economic impact or we need to have a health benefit here. This is about relationships and connectedness, which then effectively results in all of those things, which is really interesting. Massive challenge to us all. Policy needs teeth, 100%. How do we as advocates go out of this room and help to create some of that grit, not just the guidance, and not underestimate that political support that a number of you have spoken about. Really, in Greater Manchester, we're very fortunate. We've got that. That doesn't come through nothing. It comes through hard work. It comes through actual advocacy and building that story with those individuals. And that's something other places do and can apply. I think for sure. The competing demands should not be underestimated. Heard that loud and clearly. And the partnership notion we finished on there is essential in that, but also having that vision, that strategy and that long-termism really within a place is going to be central to the next 10 years and when we look back and go, actually we've made such a difference and such a thing here. And finally really, something that has struck through none of us to make assumptions. We do it all the time, but we can't and we must challenge ourselves and each other, I think, around that, because understanding what matters to them and changing the way we work, breaking down organisational barriers and actually getting into those communities to listen, genuinely listen to those conversations, I think will be fundamental to this. In order that we make that transformation for communities that you talked about, Paul, enabled by the system and the individuals within it, but this is about making those stories visible to people and helping them to believe that that's possible for them and how they can take an active role in that. So it's been a fascinating couple of hours actually. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for your individual contributions. I think collectively that makes for great content for our viewers, and we'll look to turn this around and share that back out with you very, very soon. So thank you.